Bluets, said Inspector Burton. Parasols, horns of plenty, morals, and bolitas. Mean anything to you? Chief Inspector Wexford shrugged. Sounds like one of those magazine quizzes. What have these in common? I'll make a guess and say they're crustacea, or sea anemones. How about that? They are edible fungi, said Burton. Are they now? And what have edible fungi to do with Mrs. Hannah Kingman throwing herself off, or being pushed off, a balcony? The two men were sitting in Wexford's office at the police station, Kings Markham, in the county of Sussex. The month was November, but Wexford had only just returned from his holiday. And while he had been away, enjoying 2 weeks of Italian autumn, Hannah Kingman had committed suicide. Or so Burton had thought at first. Now he was in a dilemma. And as soon as Wexford had walked in that Monday morning, Burton had begun to tell the whole story to his chief. Wexford, getting on for 60, was a tall, ungainly, rather ugly man who had once been fat to the point of obesity, but had slimmed to gauntness for reasons of health. Nearly 20 years his junior, Burton had the slenderness of a man who has always been thin. His face was ascetic, handsome in a frosty way. The older man, who had a good wife who looked after him devotedly, nevertheless always looked as if his clothes came off the peg from the war-on-want shop, while the younger, a widower, was sartorially immaculate. A tramp and a Beau Brummel, they seemed to be, but the dandy relied on the tramp, trusted him, understood his powers and his perception. In secret, he almost worshipped him. Without his chief, he had felt a little at sea in this case. Everything had pointed at first to Hannah Kingman's having killed herself. She had been a manic depressive, with a strong sense of her own inadequacy. Apparently her marriage, though not of long duration, had been unhappy, and her previous marriage had failed. Even in the absence of a suicide note or suicide threats, Burton would have taken her death for self-destruction, if her brother hadn't come along and told him about the edible fungi. And Wexford hadn't been there to do what he always could do, sort out sheep from goats and wheat from chaff. The thing is, Burton said across the desk, we're not looking for proof of murder so much as proof of attempted murder. Axel Kingman could have pushed his wife off that balcony. He has no alibi for the time in question. But I had no reason to think he had done so until I was told of an attempt to murder her some 2 weeks before. Which attempt has something to do with edible fungi? Burton nodded. Say with administering to her some noxious substance in a stew made from edible fungi? Though if he did it, God knows how he did it, because 3 other people, including himself, ate the stew without ill effects. I think I'd better tell you about it from the beginning. I think you had, said Wexford. The facts, Burton began, very like a prosecuting counsel, are as follows. Axel Kingman is 35 years old, and he keeps a health food shop here in the High Street called Harvest Home. Know it? When Wexford signified by a nod that he did, Burton went on. He used to be a teacher in Mirringham, and for about 7 years before he came here, he'd been living with a woman named Corinne Last. He left her, gave up his job, put all the capital he had into a shop, and married a Mrs. Hannah Nicholson. He's some sort of food freak, I take it? Said Wexford. Burton wrinkled his nose. Lot of affected nonsense, he said. Have you ever noticed what thin, pale weeds these health food people are? While the folks who live on roast beef and suet and whiskey and plum cake are full of beans and raring to go. Is Kingman a thin, pale weed? A feeble... what's the word? Aesthete, if you ask me. Anyway, he and Hannah opened this shop and took a flat in the high-rise tower our planning geniuses have been pleased to raise over the top of it. The 5th floor. Corinne Last, according to her, and according to Kingman, accepted it after a while, and they all remained friends. Tell me about them, Wexford said. "Leave the facts for a bit and tell me about them." Burden never found this easy. He was inclined to describe people as just ordinary or just like anyone else, a negative attitude which exasperated Wexford. So he made an effort. "Kingman looks the sort who wouldn't hurt a fly. The fact is, I'd apply the word gentle to him if I wasn't coming round to thinking he's a cold-blooded wife-killer. He's a total abstainer with a bee in his bonnet about drink. His father went bankrupt and finally died of a coronary as a result of alcoholism, and our Kingman is an anti-booze fanatic. The dead woman was 29. Her first husband left her after 6 months of marriage and went off with some girlfriend of hers. Hannah went back to live with her parents and had a part-time job helping out with the meals at the school where Kingman was a teacher. That was where they met." "And the other woman?" said Wexford. Burden's face took on a repressive expression. Sex outside marriage, however sanctioned by custom and general approval, was always distasteful to him. That in the course of his work he almost daily came across illicit sex had done nothing to mitigate his disapproval. As Wexford sometimes derisively put it, you would think that in Burden's eyes all the suffering in the world, and certainly all the crime, somehow derived from men and women going to bed together outside the bonds of wedlock. "God knows why he didn't marry her," Burden now said. "Personally, I think things were a lot better in the days when education authorities put their foot down about immorality among teachers." "Let's not have your views on that now, Mike," said Wexford. "Presumably Hannah Kingman didn't die because her husband didn't come to her a pure virgin." Burden flushed slightly. "I'll tell you about this Corinne last. She's very good-looking, if you like the dark sort of intense type. Her father left her some money in the house where she and Kingman lived, and she still lives in it. She's one of those women who seem to be good at everything they put their hands to. She paints and sells her paintings. She makes her own clothes. She's more or less the star in the local dramatic society. She's a violinist and plays in some string trio. Also, she writes for health magazines, and she's the author of a cookbook." "It would look, then," Wexford put in, "as if Kingman split up with her because all this was more than he could take. And hence he took up with the dull little school meals lady. No competition from her, I fancy." "I dare say you're right. As a matter of fact, that theory has already been put to me." "By whom?" said Wexford. "Just where did you get all this information, Mike?" "From an angry young man, the fourth member of the quartet, who happens to be Hannah's brother. His name is John Hood, and I think he's got a lot more to tell. But it's time I left off describing the people and got on with the story." No one saw Hannah fall from the balcony. It happened last Thursday afternoon at about 4. According to her husband, he was in a sort of office behind the shop doing what he always did on early closing day, stock-taking and sticking labels on various bottles and packets. She fell onto a hard-top parking area at the back of the flats, and her body was found by a neighbor a couple of hours later between 2 parked cars. We were sent for, and Kingman seemed to be distraught. I asked him if he had any idea that his wife would have wished to take her own life, and he said she had never threatened to do so, but had lately been very depressed, and there had been quarrels, principally about money. Her doctor had put her on tranquilizers, of which, by the way, Kingman disapproved, and the doctor himself, old Dr. Castle, told me Mrs. Kingman had been to him for depression, and because she felt her life wasn't worth living, and she was a drag on her husband. He wasn't surprised that she had killed herself, and neither by that time was I. We were all set for an inquest verdict of suicide while the balance of the mind was disturbed, when John Hood walked in here and told me Kingman had attempted to murder his wife on a previous occasion." "He told you just like that?" "Pretty well. It's plain he doesn't like Kingman, and no doubt he was fond of his sister. He also seems to like and admire Corinne last. He told me that on a Saturday night at the end of October, the 4 of them had a meal together in the Kingman's flat. It was a lot of vegetarian stuff cooked by Kingman. He always did the cooking, and one of the dishes was made out of what I'm old-fashioned enough, or maybe narrow-minded enough, to call toadstools. They all ate it, and they were all okay, but for Hannah, who got up from the table, vomited for hours, and apparently was quite seriously ill. Wexford's eyebrows went up. "Elucidate, please," he said. Burden sat back, put his elbows on the arms of the chair, and pressed the tips of his fingers together. A few days before this meal was eaten, Kingman and Hood met at the squash club, of which they are both members. Kingman told Hood that Corinne Last had promised to get him some edible fungi called Shaggy Caps from her own garden, the garden of the house which they had at one time shared. A crop of these things show themselves every autumn under a tree in this garden. I've seen them myself, but we'll come to that in a minute. Kingman's got a thing about using weeds and whatnot for cooking, makes salads out of dandelions and sorrel, and he swears by this fungi rubbish. Says they've got far more flavor than mushrooms. Give me something that comes in a plastic bag from the supermarket every time, but no doubt it takes all sorts to make a world. By the way, this cookbook of Corinne Last's is called Cooking for Nothing, and all the recipes are for making dishes out of stuff you pull up by the wayside or pluck from the hedgerow. These warty blobs, or spotted poppets, or whatever. Had he cooked them before? Shaggy Caps, said Burden, grinning. Or Coprinus comatus. Oh yes, every year. And every year he and Corinne had eaten the resulting stew. He told Hood he was going to cook them again this time, and Hood says he seemed very grateful to Corinne for being so, well, magnanimous. Yes, I can see it would have been a wrench for her, like hearing our tune in the company of your ex-lover and your supplanter. Wexford put on a vibrant growl. Can you bear the sight of me eating our toadstools with another? As a matter of fact, said Burden seriously, it could have been just like that. Anyway, the upshot of it was that Hood was invited round for the following Saturday to taste these delicacies, and was told that Corinne would be there. Perhaps it was that fact which made him accept. Well, the day came. Hood looked in on his sister at lunchtime. She showed him the pot containing the stew, which Kingman had already made, and she said she had tasted it, and it was delicious. She also showed Hood half a dozen specimens of Shaggy Caps, which she said Kingman hadn't needed, and which they would fry for their breakfast. This is what she showed him. Burden opened a drawer in the desk and produced one of those plastic bags which he had said so inspired him with confidence. But the contents of this one hadn't come from a supermarket. He removed the wire fastener and tipped out 4 whitish, scaly objects. They were egg-shaped, or rather elongated ovals, each with a short, fleshy stalk. I picked them myself this morning, he said, from Corinne Last's garden. When they get bigger, the egg-shaped bit opens like an umbrella, or a pagoda, really, and there are sort of black gills underneath. You're supposed to eat them when they're in the stage these are. I suppose you've got a book on fungi, said Wexford. Here. This also was produced from the drawer. British fungi, edible and poisonous. And here we are. Shaggy Caps. Burden opened it at the edible section, and at a line and wash drawing of the species he held in his hand. He handed it to the chief inspector. Coprinus comatus, Wexford read aloud. A common species attaining when full grown a height of 9 inches. The fungus is frequently to be found during late summer and autumn, growing in fields, hedgerows, and often in gardens. It should be eaten before the cap opens and disgorges its inky fluid, but is at all times quite harmless. He put the book down, but didn't close it. Go on, please, Mike, he said. Hood called for Corinne, and they arrived together. They got there just after 8. At about 8:15, they all sat down to table and began the meal with avocado vinaigrette. The next course was to be the stew, followed by nut cutlets with a salad, and then an apple cake. Very obviously, there was no wine or any liquor on account of Kingman's prejudices. They drank grape juice from the shop. The kitchen opens directly out of the living dining room. Kingman brought in the stew in a large tureen and served it himself at the table, beginning, of course, with Corinne. Each one of those Shaggy Caps had been sliced in half lengthwise, and the pieces were floating in a thickish gravy to which carrots, onions, and other vegetables had been added. Now, ever since he had been invited to this meal, Hood had been feeling uneasy about eating fungi, but Corinne had reassured him, and once he began to eat it, and saw the others were eating it quite happily, he stopped worrying for the time being. In fact, he had a second helping. Kingman took the plates out in the empty tureen and immediately rinsed them under the tap. Both Hood and Corinne last have told me this, though Kingman says it was something he always did, being fastidious about things of that sort.
Surely his ex-girlfriend could confirm or deny that, Wexford put in, since they lived together for so long.
We must ask her. All traces of the stew were rinsed away. Kingman then brought in the nut concoction and the salad, but before he could begin to serve them, Hannah jumped up, covered her mouth with a napkin, and rushed to the bathroom. After a while, Corinne went to her. Hood could hear a violent vomiting from the bathroom. He remained in the living room while Kingman and Corinne were both in the bathroom with Hannah. No one ate any more. Kingman eventually came back, said that Hannah must have picked up some bug, and that he had put her to bed. Hood went into the bedroom, where Hannah was lying on the bed with Corinne sitting beside her. Her face was greenish and covered with sweat, and she was evidently in great pain, because while he was there she doubled up and groaned. She had to go to the bathroom again, and that time Kingman had to carry her back. Hood suggested Dr. Castle should be sent for, but this was strenuously opposed by Kingman, who dislikes doctors, and is one of those people who go in for herbal remedies, raspberry leaf tablets and chamomile tea and that sort of thing. Also, he told Hood, rather absurdly, that Hannah had had quite enough to do with doctors, and that if this wasn't some gastric germ, it was the result of her taking dangerous tranquilizers. Hood thought Hannah was seriously ill, and the argument got heated, with Hood trying to make Kingman either call a doctor or take her to a hospital. Kingman wouldn't do it, and Corinne took his part. Hood is one of those angry but weak people who are all bluster, and although he might have called a doctor himself, he didn't. The effect on him of Corinne again, I suppose. What he did do was tell Kingman he was a fool to mess about cooking things everyone knew weren't safe, to which Kingman replied that if the Shaggy Caps were dangerous, how was it they weren't all ill? Eventually, at about midnight, Hannah stopped retching, seemed to have no more pain, and fell asleep. Hood drove Corinne home, returned to the Kingmans, and remained there for the rest of the night, sleeping on their sofa. In the morning, Hannah seemed perfectly well, though weak, which rather upset Kingman's theory about the gastric bug. Relations between the brothers-in-law were strained. Kingman said he hadn't liked Hood's suggestions, and that when he wanted to see his sister, he, Kingman, would rather he came there when he was out or in the shop. Hood went off home, and since that day, he hasn't seen Kingman. The day after his sister's death, he stormed in here, told me what I've told you, and accused Kingman of trying to poison Hannah. He was wild and nearly hysterical, but I felt I couldn't dismiss this allegation as, well, the ravings of a bereaved person. There were too many peculiar circumstances. The unhappiness of the marriage, the fact of Kingman rinsing those plates, his refusal to call a doctor. Was I right? Burton stopped and sat waiting for approval. It came in the form of a not very enthusiastic nod. After a moment, Wexford spoke. Could Kingman have pushed her off that balcony, Mike? She was a small, fragile woman. It was physically possible. The back of the flats isn't overlooked. There's nothing behind but the parking area and then open fields. Kingman could have gone up by the stairs instead of using the lift and come down by the stairs. 2 of the flats on the lower floors are empty. Below the Kingmans lives a bedridden woman whose husband was at work. Below that, the tenant, a young married woman, was in, but she saw and heard nothing. The invalid says she thinks she heard a scream during the afternoon, but she did nothing about it. And if she did hear it, so what? It seems to me that a suicide in those circumstances is as likely to cry out as a murder victim. Okay, said Wexford. Now to return to the curious business of this meal. The idea would presumably be that Kingman intended to kill her that night, but that his plan misfired because whatever he gave her wasn't toxic enough. She was very ill, but she didn't die. He chose those means and that company so that he would have witnesses to his innocence. They all ate the stew out of the same tureen, but only Hannah was affected by it. How, then, are you suggesting he gave her whatever poison he did give her? I'm not, said Burton frankly, but others are making suggestions. Hood's a bit of a fool, and first of all he would only keep on about all fungi being dangerous and the whole dish being poisonous. When I pointed out that this was obviously not so, he said Kingman must have slipped something into Hannah's plate, or else it was the salt. What salt? He remembered that no one but Hannah took salt with the stew. But that's absurd, because Kingman couldn't have known that would happen. He wouldn't have dared put, say, arsenic in the salt cellar on the thin chance that only she would take salt. Besides, she recovered far too quickly for it to have been arsenic. Corinne Last, however, has a more feasible suggestion. Not that she goes along with Hood. She refuses to consider the possibility that Kingman might be guilty, but when I pressed her, she said she was not actually sitting at the table while the stew was served. She had got up and gone into the hall to fetch her handbag, so she didn't see Kingman serve Hannah. Burton reached across and picked up the book Wexford had left open at the description and drawing of the Shaggy Caps. He flicked over to the poisonous section and pushed the book back to the Chief Inspector. Have a look at some of these. Ah, yes, said Wexford. Our old friend, the fly agaric. A nice-looking little red job with white spots, much favored by illustrators of children's books. They usually stick a frog on top of it and a gnome underneath. I see that when ingested it causes nausea, vomiting, tetanic convulsions, coma, and death. Lots of these agarics, aren't there? Purple, crested, warty, verdigris, all more or less lethal. Aha! The death cap. Amanita phalloides. How very unpleasant. The most dangerous fungus known, it says here. Very small quantities will cause intense suffering and often death. So where does all that get us? Corinne Last says that the death cap is quite common round here. What she doesn't say, but what I infer, is that Kingman could have got hold of it easily. Now, suppose he cooked just one specimen separately and dropped it into the stew just before he brought it in from the kitchen. When he comes to serve Hannah, he spoons up for her this specimen, or the pieces of it, in the same way as someone might select a special piece of chicken for someone out of a casserole. The gravy was thick, it wasn't like a thin soup. Wexford looked dubious. Well, we won't dismiss it as a theory. If he had contaminated the rest of the stew and others had been ill, that would have made it look even more like an accident, which was presumably what he wanted. But there's one drawback to that, Mike. If he meant Hannah to die and was unscrupulous enough not to mind about Corinne and Hood being made ill, why did he rinse the plates? To prove that it was an accident, he would have wanted above all to keep some of that stew for analysis when the time came, for analysis would have shown the presence of poisonous as well as non-poisonous fungi, and it would have seemed that he had merely been careless. But let's go and talk to these people, shall we? The shop called Harvest Home was closed. Wexford and Burton went down an alley at the side of the block, passed the glass-doored main entrance, and went to the back, to a door that was labeled Stairs and Emergency Exit. They entered a small, tiled vestibule and began to mount a steepish flight of stairs. On each floor was a front door and a door to the lift. There was no one about. If there had been, and they had had no wish to be seen, it would only have been necessary to wait behind a bend in the stairs until whoever it was had got into the lift. The bell by the front door on the 5th floor was marked A&H Kingman. Wexford rang it. The man who admitted them was smallish and mild-looking, and he looked sad. He showed Wexford the balcony from which his wife had fallen. It was one of two in the flat, the other being larger and extending outside the living room windows. This one was outside a glazed kitchen door, a place for hanging washing and for gardening of the window box variety. Herbs grew in pots, and in a long trough there still remained frost-bitten tomato vines. The wall surrounding the balcony was about 3 feet high, the drop sheer to the hard-top below. "Were you surprised that your wife committed suicide, Mr. Kingman?" said Wexford. Kingman didn't answer directly. "My wife set a very low valuation on herself. When we got married, I thought she was like me, a simple sort of person who doesn't ask much from life, but has quite a capacity for contentment. It wasn't like that. She expected more support and more comfort and encouragement than I could give. That was especially so for the first 3 months of our marriage. Then she seemed to turn against me. She was very moody, always up and down. My business isn't doing very well, and she was spending more money than we could afford. I don't know where all the money was going, and we quarreled about it. Then she'd become depressed and say she was no use to me. She'd be better dead." He had given, Wexford thought, rather a long explanation for which he hadn't been asked. But it could be that these thoughts, defensive yet self-reproachful, were at the moment uppermost in his mind. "Mr. Kingman," he said, "we have reason to believe, as you know, that foul play may have been involved here. I should like to ask you a few questions about a meal you cooked on October 29th, after which your wife was ill." "I can guess who's been telling you about that." Wexford took no notice. "When did Miss Last bring you these, Shaggy Caps?" "On the evening of the 28th. I made the stew from them in the morning, according to Miss Last's own recipe." "Was there any other type of fungus in the flat at the time?" "Mushrooms, probably." "Did you, at any time, add any noxious object or substance to that stew, Mr. Kingman?" Kingman said quietly, wearily, "Of course not. My brother-in-law has a lot of ignorant prejudices. He refused to understand that that stew, which I have made dozens of times before in exactly the same way, was as wholesome as, say, a chicken casserole. More wholesome, in my view." "Very well. Nevertheless, your wife was very ill. Why didn't you call a doctor?" "Because my wife was not very ill. She had pains and diarrhea, that's all. Perhaps you aren't aware of what the symptoms of fungus poisoning are. The victim doesn't just have pain and sickness. His vision is impaired. He very likely blacks out or has convulsions of the kind associated with tetanus. There was nothing like that with Hannah." "It was unfortunate that you rinsed those plates. Had you not done so and called a doctor, the remains of that stew would almost certainly have been sent for analysis. And if it was as harmless as you say, all this investigation could have been avoided." "It was harmless," Kingman said stonily. Out in the car, Wexford said, "I'm inclined to believe him, Mike. And unless Hood or Corinne Last has something really positive to tell us, I'd let it rest. Shall we go and see her next?" The cottage she had shared with Axel Kingman was on a lonely stretch of road outside the village of Myfleet. It was a stone cottage with a slate roof surrounded by a well-tended, pretty garden. A green Ford Escort stood on a drive in front of a weatherboard garage. Under a big old apple tree from which the yellow leaves were falling, the Shaggy Caps, immediately recognizable, grew in 3 thick clumps. She was a tall woman, the owner of this house, with a beautiful square-jawed, high-cheekboned face and a mass of dark hair. Wexford was at once reminded of the Klimt painting of a languorous, red-lipped woman, gold-neckleted, half-covered in gold draperies, though Corinne Last wore a sweater and a denim smock. Her voice was low and measured. He had the impression she could never be flustered or caught off her guard. "You're the author of a cookbook, I believe?" he said. She made no answer, but handed him a paperback which she took down from a bookshelf. Cooking for Nothing, Dishes from Hedgerow and Pasture, by Corinne Last. He looked through the index and found the recipe he wanted. Opposite it was a colored photograph of 6 people eating what looked like brown soup. The recipe included carrots, onions, herbs, cream, and a number of other harmless ingredients. The last lines read, "Stewed shaggy caps are best served piping hot with whole wheat bread. For drinkables, see page 171. He glanced at page 171, then handed the book to Burden. "This was the dish Mr. Kingman made that night?" "Yes." She had a way of leaning back when she spoke and of half-lowering her heavy, glossy eyelids. It was serpentine and a little repellent. "I picked the shaggy caps myself out of this garden. I don't understand how they could have made Hannah ill, but they must have, because she was fine when we first arrived. She hadn't got any sort of gastric infection. That's nonsense. And there was nothing wrong with the avocados or the dressing." Burden put the book aside. "But you were all served stew out of the same tureen." "I didn't see Axel actually serve Hannah. I was out of the room." The eyelids flickered and almost closed. "Was it usual for Mr. Kingman to rinse plates as soon as they were removed?" "Don't ask me." She moved her shoulders. "I don't know. I do know that Hannah was very ill just after eating that stew. Axel doesn't like doctors, of course, and perhaps it would have, embarrassed him to call Dr. Castle in the circumstances. Hannah had black spots in front of her eyes. She was getting double vision. I was extremely concerned for her." "But you didn't take it on yourself to get a doctor, Miss Last? Or even support Mr. Hood in his allegations?" "Whatever John Hood said, I knew it couldn't be the Shaggy Caps." There was a note of scorn when she spoke Hood's name, and I was rather frightened. I couldn't help thinking it would be terrible if Axel got into some sort of trouble, if there was an inquiry or something." "There's an inquiry now, Miss Last." "Well, it's different now, isn't it? Hannah's dead. I mean, it's not just suspicion or conjecture anymore." She saw them out and closed the front door before they had reached the garden gate. Farther along the roadside and under the hedges, more shaggy caps could be seen, as well as other kinds of fungi that Wexford couldn't identify. Little mushroom-like things with pinkish gills, a cluster of small yellow umbrellas, and from the trunk of an oak tree, bulbous smoke-colored swellings that Burden said were oyster mushrooms. "That woman," said Wexford, "is a mistress of the artless insinuation. She damned Kingman with almost every word, but she never came out with a direct insinuation." He shook his head. "I suppose Hood will be at work?" "Presumably," said Burden, but Hood was not at work. He was waiting for them at the police station, fuming at the delay and threatening, if something wasn't done at once, to take his grievances to the chief constable, even to the Home Office. "Something is being done," said Wexford quietly. "I'm glad you've come here, Mr. Hood. But try to keep calm, will you, please?" It was apparent to Wexford from the first that John Hood was in a different category of intelligence from that of Kingman and Corinne Last. He was a thick-set man of perhaps no more than 27 or 28, with bewildered, resentful blue eyes and a puffy, flushed face. A man, Wexford thought, who would fling out rash accusations he couldn't substantiate, who would be driven to bombast and bluster in the company of the ex-teacher and that clever, subtle woman. He began to talk now, not wildly, but still without restraint, repeating what he had said to Burden, reiterating, without putting forward any real evidence, that his brother-in-law had meant to kill his sister that night. It was only by luck that she had survived. Kingman was a ruthless man who would have stopped at nothing to be rid of her. He, Hood, would never forgive himself that he hadn't made a stand and called the doctor. Yes, Mr. Hood, but what exactly were your sister's symptoms?" "Vomiting and stomach pains, violent pains," said Hood.
She complained of nothing else. Wasn't that enough? That's what you get when someone feeds you poisonous rubbish.
Wexford merely raised his eyebrows. Abruptly he left the events of that evening and said, "What had gone wrong with your sister's marriage?" Before Hood replied, Wexford could sense he was keeping something back. A wariness came into his eyes and then was gone.
"Axel wasn't the right person for her," he began. "She had problems. She needed understanding. She wasn't—"
His voice trailed away.
"Wasn't what, Mr. Hood? What problems?" "It's got nothing to do with all this," Hood muttered. "I'll be the judge of that. You made this accusation. You started this business off. It's not for you now to keep anything back."
On a sudden inspiration, Wexford said, "Had these problems anything to do with the money she was spending?" Hood was silent and sullen. Wexford thought rapidly over the things he had been told. Axel Kingman's fanaticism on one particular subject, Hannah's desperate need of an unspecified kind of support during the early days of her marriage, and later on her alternating moods. Then the money, the weekly sums of money spent and unaccounted for. He looked up and said baldly, "Was your sister an alcoholic, Mr. Hood?" Hood hadn't liked his directness. He flushed and looked affronted. He skirted round a frank answer. "Well, yes, she drank. She was at pains to conceal her drinking. It had been going on more or less consistently since her first marriage broke up." "In fact, she was an alcoholic," said Wexford.
"I suppose so."
"Your brother-in-law didn't know?"
"Good God, no. Axel would have killed her."
He realized what he had said.
"Maybe that's why. Maybe he found out."
"I don't think so, Mr. Hood. Now, I imagine that in the first few months of her marriage she made an effort to give up drinking. She needed a good deal of support during this time, but she couldn't or wouldn't tell Mr. Kingman why she needed it. Her efforts failed, and slowly, because she couldn't manage without it, she began drinking again."
"She wasn't as bad as she used to be," Hood said with pathetic eagerness. "And only in the evenings. She told me she never had a drink before 6, and then she'd have a few more, gulping them down on the quiet so Axel wouldn't know."
Burden said suddenly, "Had your sister been drinking that evening?"
"I expect so. She wouldn't have been able to face company, not even just Corrine and me, without a drink."
"Did anyone besides yourself know that your sister drank?"
"My mother did. My mother and I had a sort of pact to keep it dark from everyone so that Axel wouldn't find out."
He hesitated, then said rather defiantly,
"I did tell Corrine. She's a wonderful person. She's very clever. I was worried about it, and I didn't know what I ought to do. She promised she wouldn't tell Axel."
"I see." Wexford had his own reasons for thinking that hadn't happened. Deep in thought, he got up and walked to the other end of the room, where he stood gazing out the window. Burden's continuing questions, Hood's answers, reached him only as a confused murmur of voices. Then he heard Burden say more loudly, "That's all for now, Mr. Hood, unless the Chief Inspector has anything more to ask you." No, said Wexford abstractedly, and when Hood had somewhat truculently departed, "Time for lunch." "It's past 2. Personally, I shall avoid any dishes containing fungi, even Saliota campestris." After Burden had looked that one up and identified it as the common mushroom, they lunched and then made a round of such wine shops in King's Markham as were open at that hour. At the wine basket they drew a blank, but the assistant in the vineyard told them that a woman answering Hannah Kingman's description had been a regular customer, and that on the previous Wednesday, the day before her death, she had called in and bought a bottle of Courvoisier cognac. "There was no liquor of any kind in Kingman's flat," said Burden. "Might have been an empty bottle in the rubbish, I suppose." He made a rueful face. "We didn't look. Didn't think we had any reason to." "But she couldn't have drunk a whole bottleful on the Wednesday, could she?" "Why are you so interested in this drinking business, Mike? You don't seriously see it as a motive for murder, do you?
That Kingman killed her because she'd found out? Or been told that she was a secret drinker? It was a means, not a motive, said Burton. I know how it was done. I know how Kingman tried to kill her that first time. He grinned. Makes a change for me to find the answer before you, doesn't it? I'm going to follow in your footsteps and make a mystery of it for the time being, if you don't mind. With your permission, we'll go back to the station, pick up those Shaggy Caps, and conduct a little experiment. Michael Burton lived in a neat bungalow in Tabard Road, Kingsmarkham. He had lived there with his wife until her untimely and tragic death, and continued to live there still with his 16-year-old daughter, his son being away at a university. But that evening, Pat Burton was out with her boyfriend, and there was a note left for her father on the refrigerator. Dad, I ate the cold beef from yesterday. Can you open a tin for yourself? Back by 11. Love, P. I'm glad she hasn't cooked anything, said Burton, with what Wexford called his sloppy look, the expression that came over his face whenever he thought his children might be inconvenienced or made to lift a finger on his account. I shouldn't be able to eat it, and I'd hate her to take it as criticism. Wexford made the sound that used to be written, Shaw. You've got sensible kids, and you treat them like paranoiacs. While you're deciding just how much I'm to be told about this experiment of yours, do you mind if I phone my wife? Be my guest. It was nearly 6. Wexford came back to find Burton peeling carrots and onions. The 4 specimens of Coprinus comatus, beginning now to look a little wizened, lay on a chopping board. On the stove, a saucepan full of bone stock was heating up. What the hell are you doing? Making Shaggy Caps stew. My theory is that the stew is harmless when eaten by non-drinkers, and toxic or toxic to some extent when taken by those with alcohol in the stomach. How about that? In a minute, when this lot's cooking, I'm going to take a moderate quantity of alcohol. Then I'm going to eat the stew. Now, say I'm a damned fool if you like. Wexford shrugged. He grinned. I'm overcome by so much courage and selfless devotion to the duty you owe the taxpayers. But wait a minute. Are you sure only Hannah had been drinking that night? We know Kingman hadn't. What about those other 2? I asked Hood that while you were off in your daydream. He called for Corinne last at 6, at her request. They picked some apples for his mother, then she made him coffee. He did suggest they call in at a pub for a drink on their way to the Kingmans, but apparently she took so long getting ready that they didn't have time. Okay. Go ahead, then. But wouldn't it be easier to call in an expert? There must be such people. Very likely someone holds a chair of fungology at the University of the South. Very likely. We can do that after I've tried it. I want to know for sure now. Are you willing to? Certainly not. I'm not your guest to that extent. Since I've told my wife I won't be home for dinner, I'll take it as a kindness if you'll make me some innocent scrambled eggs. He followed Burton into the living room, where the inspector opened the door in the sideboard. What do you drink? White wine, if you've got any, or vermouth if you haven't. You know how abstemious I have to be. Burton poured vermouth and soda. Ice? No, thanks. What are you going to have? Brandy? That was Hannah Kingman's favorite, apparently. Haven't got any, said Burton. It'll have to be whiskey. I think we can reckon she had 2 double brandies before that meal, don't you? I'm not so brave I want to be as ill as she was. He caught Wexford's eye. You don't think some people could be more sensitive to it than others, do you? Bound to be, said Wexford breezily. Cheers. Burton sipped his heavily watered whiskey, then tossed it down. I'll just have a look at my stew. You sit down. Put the television on. Wexford obeyed him. The big colored picture was of a wood in autumn, pale blue sky, golden beech leaves. Then the camera closed in on a cluster of red and white spotted fly agaric. Chuckling, Wexford turned it off as Burton put his head round the door. I think it's more or less ready. Better have another whiskey. I suppose I had. Burton came in and refilled his glass. That ought to do it. Oh, God, I forgot. I'm not much of a cook, you know. Don't know how women manage to get a whole lot of different things brewing and make them synchronize. It is a mystery, isn't it? I'll get myself some bread and cheese, if I may. The brownish mixture was in a soup bowl. In the gravy floated 4 Shaggy Caps, cut lengthwise. Burden finished his whiskey at a gulp. What was it the Christians in the arena used to say to the Roman emperor before they went to the lions? Morituri te salutamus, said Wexford. We who are about to die salute thee. Well, Burden made an effort with the Latin he had culled from his son's homework. Moriturus te saluto. Would that be right? I dare say. You won't die, though. Burden made no answer. He picked up a spoon and began to eat. Can I have some more soda? Said Wexford. There are perhaps few stabs harder to bear than derision directed at one's heroism. Burden gave him a sour look. Help yourself, I'm busy. The chief inspector did so. What's it like? He said. All right. It's quite nice, like mushrooms. Doggedly he ate. He didn't once gag on it. He finished the lot and wiped the bowl round with a piece of bread. Then he sat up, holding himself rather tensely. May as well have your telly on now, said Wexford. Pass the time. He switched it on again. No fly agaric this time, but a dog fox moving across a meadow with Vivaldi playing. How'd you feel? Fine, said Burden gloomily. Cheer up. It may not last. But it did. After 15 minutes had passed, Burden still felt perfectly well. He looked bewildered. I was so damned positive. I knew I was going to be retching and vomiting by now. I didn't put the car away because I was certain you'd have to run me down to the hospital. Wexford only raised his eyebrows. You were pretty casual about it, I must say. Didn't say a word to stop me, did you? Didn't it occur to you it might have been a bit awkward for you if anything had happened to me? I knew it wouldn't. I said to get a fungologist. And then Wexford, faced by Burden's aggrieved stare, burst out laughing. Dear old Mike, you'll have to forgive me. But you know me. Do you honestly think I'd have let you risk your life eating that stuff? I knew you were safe. May one ask how? One may. And you'd have known, too, if you'd bothered to take a proper look at that book of Corinne Last's. Under the recipe for Shaggy Cap stew, it said, For drinkables, see page 171. Well, I looked at page 171, and there Miss Last gave a recipe for cowslip wine and another for sloe gin, both highly intoxicating drinks. Would she have recommended a wine and a spirit to drink with those fungi if there had been the slightest risk? Not if she wanted to sell her book, she wouldn't. Not unless she was risking hundreds of furious letters and expensive lawsuits from her readers. Burden had flushed a little. Then he, too, began to roar with laughter. After a little while, Burden made coffee. A little logical thinking would be in order, I fancy, said Wexford. You said this morning that we were not so much seeking to prove murder as attempted murder. Axel Kingman could have pushed her off that balcony, but no one saw her fall, and no one heard him or anyone else go up to that flat during the afternoon. If, however, an attempt was made to murder her 2 weeks before, the presumption that she was eventually murdered is enormously strengthened. Burden said impatiently, We've been through all that. We know that. Wait a minute. The attempt failed. Now, just how seriously ill was she? According to Kingman and Hood, she had severe stomach pains and she vomited. By midnight she was peacefully sleeping, and by the following day she was all right. I don't see where this is getting us. To a point which is very important and which may be the crux of the whole case. You say that Axel Kingman attempted to murder her. In order to do so, he must have made very elaborate plans. The arranging of the meal, the inviting of 2 witnesses,
the ensuring that his wife tasted the stew earlier in the day, and preparing for some very nifty sleight of hand at the time the meal was served. Isn't it odd that the actual method used should so signally have failed? That Hannah's life never seems to have been in danger? And what if the method had succeeded? At post-mortem, some noxious agent would have been found in her body, or the effects of such. How could he have hoped to get away with that, since, as we know, neither of his witnesses actually watched him serve Hannah, and one of them was even out of the room? So what I am postulating is that no one attempted to murder her, but someone attempted to make her ill, so that, taken in conjunction with the sinister reputation of non-mushroom fungi, and Hood's admitted suspicion of them, taken in conjunction with the known unhappiness of the marriage, it would look as if there had been a murder attempt. Burton stared at him. Kingman would never have done that. He would either have wanted his attempt to succeed or not to have looked like an attempt at all. Exactly. And where does that get us? Instead of answering him, Burton said on a note of triumph, his humiliation still rankling, "You're wrong about one thing. She was seriously ill. She didn't just have nausea and vomiting. Kingman and Hood may not have mentioned it, but Corinne Last said she had double vision and black spots before her eyes and—" His voice faltered. "My God." "You mean—" Wexford nodded. "Corinne Last only of the three says she had those symptoms. Only Corinne Last is in a position to say because she lived with him if Kingman was in the habit of rinsing plates as soon as he removed them from the table. What does she say? That she doesn't know. Isn't that rather odd? Isn't it rather odd, too, that she chose that precise moment to leave the table and go out into the hall for her handbag? She knew that Hannah drank, because Hood had told her so. On the evening that meal was eaten, you say Hood called for her at her own request. Why? She has her own car, and I don't for a moment believe a woman like her would feel anything much but contempt for Hood. She told him there was something wrong with her car. I see. She asked him to come at 6, although they were not due at the Kingmans till 8. She gave him coffee. A funny thing to drink at that hour, wasn't it? And before a meal? So what happens when he suggests calling in at a pub on the way? She doesn't say no, or say it isn't a good idea to drink and drive. She takes so long getting ready that they don't have time. She didn't want Hood to drink any alcohol, Mike, and she was determined to prevent it. She, of course, would take no alcohol, and she knew Kingman never drank. But she also knew Hannah's habit of having her first drink of the day at about 6. Now, look at her motive. Far stronger than Kingman's. She strikes me as a violent, passionate, and determined woman. Hannah had taken Kingman away from her. Kingman had rejected her. Why not revenge herself on both of them by killing Hannah and seeing to it that Kingman was convicted of the crime? If she simply killed Hannah, she had no way of ensuring that Kingman would come under suspicion. But if she made it look as if he had previously attempted her life, the case against him would become very strong indeed. Where was she last Thursday afternoon? She could just as easily have gone up those stairs as Kingman could. Hannah would have admitted her to the flat. If she, known to be interested in gardening, had suggested that Hannah take her onto that balcony and show her the pot herbs, Hannah would willingly have done so. And then we have the mystery of the missing brandy bottle with some of its contents surely remaining. If Kingman had killed her, he would have left that there, as it would greatly have strengthened the case for suicide. Imagine how he might have used it. Heavy drinking made my wife ill that night. She knew I had lost respect for her because of her drinking. She killed herself because her mind was unbalanced by drink. Corinne Last took that bottle away because she didn't want it known that Hannah drank. and she was banking on Hood's keeping it dark from us, as he had kept it from so many people in the past. And she didn't want it known because the fake murder attempt that she staged depended on her victim having alcohol present in her body. Burden sighed, poured the last dregs of coffee into Wexford's cup. "But we tried that out," he said. "Or I tried it out, and it doesn't work." "You knew it wouldn't work from her book." "True, she brought the Shaggy Caps from her own garden, but she couldn't have mixed up poisonous fungi with them because Axel Kingman would have realized at once. Or if he hadn't, they'd all have been ill, alcohol or no alcohol. She was never alone with Hannah before the meal, and while the stew was served, she was out of the room." "I know. But we'll see her in the morning and ask her a few sharp questions. I'm going home now, Mike. It's been a long day." "Shall I run you home?" "I'll walk," said Wexford. "Don't forget to put your car away, will you? You won't be making any emergency trips to hospital tonight." With a shamefaced grin, Burden saw him out. They were unable to puncture her self-possession. The languorous, klimped face was carefully painted this morning, and she was dressed as befitted the violinist or the actress or the author. She had been forewarned of their coming, and the gardener image had been laid aside. Her long, smooth hands looked as if they had never touched the earth or pulled up a weed. Where had she been on the afternoon of Hannah Kingman's death? Her thick, shapely eyebrows went up. At home, indoors, painting. Alone? "Painters don't work with an audience," she said rather insolently, and she leaned back, dropping her eyelids in that way of hers. She lit a cigarette and flicked her fingers at Burden for an ashtray, as if he were a waiter. Wexford said, "On Saturday, October 29th, Miss Last, I believe you had something wrong with your car?" She nodded lazily. In asking what was wrong with it, he thought he might catch her. He didn't. "The glass in the off-side front headlight was broken while the car was parked," she said, and although he thought how easily she could have broken that glass herself, he could hardly say so. In the same smooth voice, she added, "Would you like to see the bill I had from the garage for repairing it?" "That won't be necessary." She wouldn't have offered to show it to him if she hadn't possessed it, he thought. "You asked Mr. Hood to call for you here at 6, I understand." "Yes. He's not my idea of the best company in the world, but I'd promised him some apples for his mother, and we had to pick them before it got dark." "You gave him coffee, but no alcohol. You had no drinks on the way to Mr. and Mrs. Kingman's flat. Weren't you a little disconcerted at the idea of going out to dinner at a place where there wouldn't even be a glass of wine?" "I was used to Mr. Kingman's ways." "But not so used," thought Wexford, "that you can tell me whether it was normal or abnormal for him to have rinsed those plates." Her mouth curled a little, betraying her a little. "It didn't bother me. I'm not a slave to liquor." "I should like to return to these, Shaggy Caps. You picked them from here on October 28th and took them to Mr. Kingman that evening. I think you said that?" "I did. I picked them from this garden." She enunciated the words precisely, her eyes wide open and gazing sincerely at him. The words, or perhaps her unusual straightforwardness, stirred in him a glimmer of an idea. But if she had said nothing more, that idea might have died as quickly as it had been born. "If you want to have them analyzed or examined or whatever, you're getting a bit late. Their season's practically over." She looked at Burden and gave him a gracious smile. "But you took the last of them yesterday, didn't you? So that's all right." Wexford, of course, said nothing about Burden's experiment. "We'll have a look in your garden, if you don't mind." She didn't seem to mind. But she had been wrong. Most of the fungi had grown into black gilt pagodas in the 24 hours that had elapsed. 2 new ones, however, had thrust their white oval caps up through the wet grass. Wexford picked them, and still she didn't seem to mind. Why, then, had she seemed to want their season to be over? He thanked her, and she went back into the cottage. The door closed. Wexford and Burden went out into the road. The fungus season was far from over. From the abundant array on the roadside, it looked as if the season would last weeks longer. Shaggy caps were everywhere, some of them smaller and grayer than the clump that grew out of Corinne Last's well-fed lawn, green and purple agarics, horn-shaped toadstools, and tiny mushrooms growing in fairy rings.
She doesn't exactly mind us having them analyzed, Wexford said thoughtfully. But it seems she'd prefer the analysis to be done on the ones you picked yesterday than on those I picked today. Can that be so, or am I just imagining it?
If you're imagining it, I'm imagining it too. But it's no good, that line of reasoning. We know they're not potentiated, or whatever the word is, by alcohol.
I shall pick some more all the same, said Wexford. Haven't got a paper bag, have you?
I've got a clean handkerchief. Will that do?
Have to,
said Wexford, who never had a clean one. He picked a dozen more young shaggy caps, big and small, white and gray, immature and fully grown. They got back into the car, and Wexford told the driver to stop at the public library. He went in and emerged a few minutes later with 3 books under his arm.
When we get back, he said to Burden, I want you to get on to the university and see what they can offer us in the way of an expert in fungology.
He closeted himself in his office with the 3 books and a pot of coffee. When it was nearly lunchtime, Burden knocked on the door.
Come in, said Wexford. How did you get on?
They don't have a fungologist, but there's a man on the faculty who's a toxicologist and who's just published one of those popular science books. This one's about poisoning by wild plants and fungi.
Wexford grinned. What's it called? Killing for Nothing? He sounds as if he'd do fine.
I said we'd see him at 6. Let's hope something will come of it.
No doubt it will.
Wexford slammed shut the thickest of his books.
We need confirmation, he said. But I found the answer.
For God's sake, why didn't you say?
You didn't ask. Sit down.
Wexford motioned him to the chair on the other side of the desk.
I said you'd done your homework, Mike, and so you had. Only your textbook wasn't quite comprehensive enough. It's got a section on edible fungi and a section on poisonous fungi, but nothing in between. What I mean by that is, there's nothing in your book about fungi which aren't wholesome yet, which don't cause death or intense suffering. There's nothing about the kind which can make a person ill under certain circumstances.
But we know they ate shaggy caps, Burden protested. And if by circumstances you mean the intake of alcohol, we know shaggy caps aren't affected by alcohol.
Mike, said Wexford quietly, do we know they ate shaggy caps?
He spread out on the desk the haul he had made from the roadside and from Corinne Last's garden.
Look closely at these, will you?
Quite bewildered now, Burden looked at and fingered the dozen or so specimens of fungi. What am I to look for?
Differences,
said Wexford laconically. Some of them are smaller than the others, and the smaller ones are grayish. Is that what you mean? But look here, think of the differences between mushrooms. You get big flat ones and small button ones, and
nevertheless, in this case it is that small difference that makes all the difference.
Wexford sorted the fungi into 2 groups.
All the small grayer ones, he said, came from the roadside. Some of the larger white ones came from Corinne Last's garden, and some from the roadside.
He picked up between forefinger and thumb a specimen of the former.
This is not a shaggy cap. It is an ink cap. Now, listen.
The thick book fell open where he had placed a marker. Slowly and clearly he read,
The ink cap, Caprinus ultramentarius, is not to be confused with the shaggy cap, Caprinus comatus. It is smaller and grayer in color, but otherwise the resemblance between them is strong. While Caprinus ultramentarius is usually harmless when cooked, it contains, however, a chemical similar to the active principle in antabuse, a drug used in the treatment of alcoholics, and if eaten in conjunction with alcohol, would cause nausea and vomiting.
We'll never prove it, Burton gasped.
I don't know about that, said Wexford. We can begin by concentrating on the one lie we know Corinne last told when she said she picked the fungi she gave Axel Kingman from her own garden.
Shadows crawl along the cobblestone, footsteps echo, yet I'm all alone. Secrets hiding under the fading light, murmurs stir the dark, just out of sight. Every corner holds a silent clue, every whisper feels like it's calling you. Hands tremble over pages worn. The truth waits where the night is torn. Follow the shapes in the silver haze, through tangled paths and hidden ways. Shaggy crowns of mystery rise under the fog, nothing hides. Rain drips softly on the window pane, memories flicker like an old refrain. Footsteps vanish where the shadows meet. A riddle hums beneath my feet. Candles flicker, hearts beat slow. The unknown dances where secrets grow. Eyes watch from corners unseen, between the lines of what has been. Follow the shapes in the silver haze, through tangled paths and hidden ways. Shaggy crowns of mystery rise under the fog, nothing hides. Step by step, the night unfolds. The story waits for the brave and bold. Whispers fade with the breaking day, but some secrets never go away.